Welcome to the IISS this evening. I am delighted to welcome Mr. Sartaj Aziz, the advisor to the Prime Minister of Pakistan on national security and foreign affairs, for his first major address in the UK. 10 months ago, landmark elections in Pakistan resulted in the first ever democratic transition from a full 5-year term civilian government to another elected government, with Mr. Nawaz Sharif elected as Prime Minister for the third time. This took place amidst severe economic, energy, and security challenges. From a foreign policy perspective, the most important challenge for Pakistan, arguably, are the multiple transitions taking place in neighboring Afghanistan, especially in view of a fast approaching deadline on the drawdown of NATO ISAF combat forces by the end of this year. To talk about the post-2014 transition in Afghanistan, Pakistan's perspectives on regional security and stability, I am especially delighted to introduce Mr. Sartaj Aziz, who was appointed last June as the Prime Minister's advisor on national security and foreign affairs. Earlier, Mr. Aziz served as a finance minister as well as a foreign minister of Pakistan. He has also had a distinguished career as a civil servant in the Finance Ministry and the National Planning Commission. Indeed, oddly enough, we know quite a lot about Mr. Aziz thanks to his memoirs, Between Dreams and Realities, Some Milestones in Pakistan's History, published 5 years ago. While the IISS is not in the business of marketing books, I would, however, thoroughly recommend this book to all of you as a powerful perspective on Pakistan's history, politics, and foreign and security policies. This book ends with the fourth phase of Mr. Aziz's career as the Vice Chancellor of Beacon House National University in Lahore. We now welcome the fifth phase of Mr. Aziz's career as advisor to the Prime Minister of Pakistan on national security and foreign affairs. Sir, you have the floor.
Mr. Rahul Rai Chaudhary, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, may I thank Rahul Chaudhary for a very warm and generous introduction, and also thank the Institute for providing me this opportunity to share my views on post-2014 transition in Afghanistan, Pakistan's perspective on regional security and stability at this prestigious venue of policy influentials. Surely the Institute, the International Institute of Strategic Studies, is known for its reservoir of cutting-edge expertise on security-related issues, and I look forward to this interactive session with such a learned audience. Those of you who have studied Afghanistan or read about it would agree with me that its history is a theater of great power rivalry and intervention. And so is its reputation as a graveyard of empires. As you know, many empires came and collapsed within Afghanistan. More recently, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 lasted for more than 10 years and finally culminated in the end of the Cold War. We don't realize that it was the Russian quote-unquote defeat in Afghanistan which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and therefore ended the Cold War. The consequences of that misadventure for the global system aside, many of the internal ethnic and tribal balances that had evolved in Afghanistan over 2 centuries were seriously disturbed and damaged during those 10 fateful years. So that the process of those tribal and other loyalties moving together was disrupted and new forces emerged which created the chaotic situation. And as a result, as the Cold War considerations disappeared, the international community also made a hasty exit, leaving virtually Pakistan to handle all the consequences of that war in terms of refugees, guns, and others. And Afghanistan, of course, remained mired in conflict that eventually created the conditions in which a global terrorist network was able to function and flourish with palpable ease. So this is also a fact to remember, that the growth of terrorism which led to 9/11, etc., if at all, was actually creating that power vacuum and upsetting their traditional tribal and other systems that created that vacuum in which these people intervened and created this network. As for the current phase, the post-9/11 military intervention by the US has become the longest war in American history. The results of this venture are mixed at best. More than 1 decade and trillions of dollars later, the many accomplishments are overshadowed by myriad challenges. This has indeed been there has been impressive progress in reviving the economy, expanded education and health facilities, improving transport and communication, and some elements of a democratic system. But at the same time, the security situation remains volatile, the national reconciliation process still dogged, and poverty and underdevelopment rather pervasive. So this is the rough balance sheet of the situation that Americans and its allies are leaving behind. Pakistan, of course, is the closest neighbor of Afghanistan and shares multiple ethnic, religious, and cultural commonalities. More significantly, the two countries share a common strategic space in the region because we are a part of that geographical space that we share. From the outside, Pakistan was and continues to remain directly affected by the happenings next door. While we hosted the largest refugee population in the world for almost 3 decades, we suffer dearly from the culture of violence and extremism, arms proliferation, narco-trafficking. From warlordism to cross-border organized crime, Pakistan continues to suffer the brunt of this unstable situation in Afghanistan. The clearest lesson that we can draw from 3 decades of conflict and turmoil in Afghanistan is that the security and future prosperity of the two countries are closely interlinked. The impact of the crisis in Afghanistan and their spillover into Pakistan continues to be formidable. The price paid by Pakistan in handling the fallout of the Afghan situation has been incalculable, both in terms of blood and treasure. Looking ahead, of course, a major source of concern for Pakistan remains the specter of any fresh influx of refugees. We already have 1.7 million registered refugees, another 1 million plus unregistered refugees who have melted into the population, and therefore, if the economic crisis that seem to be coming up leads to massive unemployment, we will have a very serious further influx of refugees which we cannot afford. And therefore, apart from militancy, arms, drugs, and other negative cross-border part of the four concerns that we have, the further influx of refugees is another major concern that we face in the post-2014 phase. So you can see from this brief analysis, Pakistan's vital stakes in a peaceful, stable, and united Afghanistan. Such an Afghanistan is critical for us as we have our own many problems and challenges that we have to solve: extremism, internal security, energy, and revival of the economy. And therefore, in the medium and longer term perspective, Pakistan's vision of progress and prosperity through enhanced regional cooperation cannot be realized unless we achieve sustainable peace and stability in Afghanistan. For Afghanistan itself is now in a defining moment in history. It wants to emerge from decades of instability and conflict and step into a peaceful and stable future. It's a new beginning which is fraught with challenges and yet brimming with hope. And Afghanistan is now facing 3 transitions: security transitions, political transitions, and economic transition, which are all in a way interconnected and have a major influence on the region. The political transition, of course, is marked by the forthcoming elections, which are due on the 5th of April, and this will be a very important factor in stability in Afghanistan. And the security transition, of course, involves the drawdown of ISAF forces, and the challenge now is how to ensure, as a result of these 3 transitions, regional and global security. And for this, we require both preventive measures and proactive measures. Preventive measures could include enhanced border security, defense and intelligence capabilities, counter-terrorism and counter-narcotics effort, and so on. But these only address a partial spectrum of the problem. What is needed is a proactive approach involving peace cultivation through a forward-looking, multi-track, and cross-cutting strategy. How can we therefore, and this is the basic question which I want to address, secure and provide regional security and stability, because the importance of that I have highlighted, and the challenges to that concept of peace and stability I have also tried to summarize briefly. So let's look at each of these transitions and see how we can ensure stability. The peaceful political transition includes, of course, not only the Afghan election, but also the security capability of the Afghan national forces and the transformation of the war economy into a peaceful and stable economy, because without that, they would not be able to deal with all the economic and other problems which the country is likely to face. But the more serious challenge is the second one, and that is the progress for peace, which requires a comprehensive reconciliation process among all the stakeholders. And therefore, the message to all the Afghan stakeholders should be clear and unequivocal: negotiate, don't fight, mutually understand each other, and believe in the policy of give and take. So reconciliation will take place if these three conditions are met. Pakistan, of course, has taken a number of steps to facilitate this process of reconciliation. We have released many Afghan detainees at the request of the Afghan Government High Peace Council. We also support the High Peace Council's roadmap to engage the Taliban, which offers them unelected positions because they don't want to take part in the elections. And we will therefore continue to work with the Afghan government and the High Peace Council to advance these objectives of reconciliation. In this context, I think Pakistan's role is generally overplayed. It is important, but we do not have the key to reconciliation. Ours is, in fact, an unenviable position with high and often unrealistic expectations, because our influence has limits. Ultimately, the primary responsibility rests with the Afghans themselves to come together, make peace, and rebuild their economy. They must work out an Afghan solution for Afghanistan. The third element in this roadmap is the regional consensus on non-interference. As I mentioned earlier, there have been great power rivalries and great games in Afghanistan played by all kinds of powers. What we now need is a consensus among the regional countries and other stakeholders on non-interference in Afghanistan. Pakistan, of course, has announced that we have no favorites in Afghanistan. It is therefore our hope that other regional players will also refrain from meddling in Afghan affairs, and no repeat of what happened in the 90s will take place. And there should be no scope for anyone using the Afghan territory to destabilize others. Instead, the international community can and should help Afghanistan by supporting reconstruction and economic development. Basically, what this means is that, like the past when different countries fought their proxy wars on the soil of Afghanistan, this time we must allow Afghans to find a solution. We must follow a non-interference policy. Once they have found a political solution, then we can all compete in reconstruction, development, and all the related trade and investment activities, rather than try to promote, use Afghanistan soil for our own agendas. In this context, I think the importance of long-term economic assistance to Afghanistan is the fourth element of this package, this roadmap, because the economic vacuum that will happen will have fateful consequences. The ISAF expenditures in Afghanistan is almost 70–80% of their GDP. And when that dries up, there will be a drastic reduction in economic activities, unless it's replaced by other economic activities with outside assistance, because their own budget right now covers only 10–12% of their total expenditure. The rest all comes from outside. So there is a need for assistance which will keep the economic activity at a higher level. So this is important, therefore, that international support continues, and in this context, all the pledges and commitments of assistance to Afghanistan should remain. As some of you remember, there was a Tokyo meeting which promised $16 billion in 4 years, almost $4 billion a year. But the benchmark for that assistance are no longer relevant. There were different kind of performance indicators which they cannot fulfill. This should be an emergency employment generation program based on decentralized. One of the tragedies of the foreign assistance to Afghanistan in the past has been how little has reached the people themselves. The pattern was very unfortunate. The contracts were given to outside contractors, which kept 50% of the money and gave a subcontract at 50% to the Turkish or local contractors, who kept 25% and passed on with corruption. Only 10-15% reached the people, and therefore the impact of all this assistance on the local people and on well-being of the people was minimal. So now we need a new system of channeling funds, and the secret lies in decentralization. In other words, all the money should not be flow through Kabul, because that's the only way to save it. If it's given to each province, to each district, to spend on certain pre-specified irrigation works, roads, education, health, other things, even if there's leakage, it will create purchasing power in those areas rather than only in Kabul and abroad. So I think in that sense, you require a new approach to disbursement of foreign assistance if that happens. But of course, in this context, you have to develop Afghan institution, develop their human resources, as well as continue the progress in education and health that they have already achieved. And I think in this context, there are great opportunities for regional cooperation, both in energy, in transport, and in connectivity. Pakistan has just signed, approved a Kaza 1000, which is purchase of electricity from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, their surplus electricity, which passes through Afghanistan, and 300 megawatts go there and 1,000 comes to Pakistan. This is the kind of energy connectivity that we need on a much larger scale, but this is the first project which is coming. Similarly, transit trade agreement between Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan would help to open up the Afghan transit facilities to others. So Afghanistan's economic potential, once aid dries up, lies in promoting regional trade and energy connectivity, which will give them the opportunity, because both Pakistan and Afghanistan are very critical in terms of connecting South Asia on the one hand and Central Asia and West Asia on the other. And South Asia, as you know, is energy deficient, and both the other regions are energy surplus. So energy connectivity can open up vast opportunities for development which will benefit Afghanistan. So energy, transport, and other connectivities are critical for Afghanistan's long term. Why should, unlike 1990s, the international community give importance to Afghanistan? This is a question that is not difficult to answer, because I think the experience of the 90s shows that if at that time the world had not abandoned Afghanistan and spent even 5% of what they have spent in the last 12 years, Afghanistan today would be a different place. But by walking away and allowing those people who were helped defeat the Soviet forces, they started fighting among each other and created the kind of vacuum that sucked in other people. So that lesson must not be forgotten, and therefore instability that happens there spills over not only to the neighboring countries, but all over the world, as you saw after 1990s. So if you want to deal with terrorism and drugs and transnational organized crime in a fundamental and sustained way, we must help Afghanistan deal with these problems and stand on its own. And therefore, we need this mutually reinforcing actions in all these three fronts that we are talking about. And that's the only way we can ensure, because security is indivisible, and instability, once it happens, as from our own experience, continues to spread very rapidly. And therefore, the cost of providing and maintaining peace is invariably a fraction of the cost of making and securing peace afterwards, as we have seen now. And even then, we have not been successful in ensuring peace. So at this consequential moment, therefore, any impulse to abandon Afghanistan because enough is enough kind of fatigue should not happen, must be strongly resisted. In our own enlightened self-interest, there should be deeper and across-the-board engagement. So in conclusion, I'll only say that the valiant Afghan people have shed enough blood through the past 3 decades, resisting foreign forces invading Afghan territory in their military and strategic pursuit. And it's really tragic that the strongest superpower, one of the 2 strongest superpower, Russia, invades the poorest country of the world. And for what purpose and for what reason is not known, but yet that happened. And so it is about time that Afghanistan opportunity realizes potential as a great connector and a land bridge. And instead of armies and weapons, Afghanistan should host trade, investment, energy resources, and tourism. This is how Pakistan would like to share the geographical space with Afghanistan in the future. And Pakistan wishes to see Afghanistan emerge as a regional economic and commercial hub rather than an exporter of terrorism. Let me therefore conclude with the famous verses from Rudyard Kipling, Cities and Thrones and Powers. Cities and thrones and powers stand in time's eye, almost as long as flowers which daily die, but as new buds put forth to glad new men, out of the spent and unconsidered earth, the cities rise again. So let's hope, ladies and gentlemen, Afghanistan will rise again. With these words, I thank you for your patient hearing.
Thank you very much, sir, for that very useful focus on how Pakistan can provide a roadmap for a sustainable peace in Afghanistan. You've touched upon several issues in your remarks, including a comprehensive reconciliation process, economic aspects, and energy, promoting regional trade and energy connectivity. I want to ask, and I want to begin the discussion session by focusing on the other aspect you talked about and trying to push you a bit on this, and that is your view on a regional consensus on non-interference among the countries in the region. This is something that clearly needs to be done. It needs to be the center of focus, but the question seems to be as to how one is able to actually initiate a process where this can take place, where there are several trilateral and bilateral dialogues on a number of these issues, but key discussions in terms of non-interference on Afghanistan among the regional players hasn't taken off, and there appears to be no forum or a bilateral or trilateral focus on these issues, which I agree is a key aspect for the future stability of Afghanistan.
I think it's a very valid and important question. And it is, since the process of this particular objective is very recent, it is not yet widely known. I think the basic, soon after our government came in, we realized that the gap between Afghanistan and Pakistan was very wide and the relationship was very strained. And when I visited Kabul in July last year, I discovered that their apprehensions were rather strong. And they felt that they have achieved a lot of progress in the last 12 years in terms of various institutions, education, health, media, communications, and some semblance of democracy. And that's all threatened because the Taliban are threatening it, and they are doing so because Pakistan is supporting them. So this was the dominant perception. So we tried to convince them, and then President Karzai came to Pakistan next month in August, and the Prime Minister had a detailed discussion on him. And we were able to convince him that Taliban coming to power by force is not in Pakistan's own security interest. And this is not because we are for or against them, but in the present context with other part of Taliban, fighting us within Pakistan, if they become stronger, then they become a stronger threat to us. And this obviously is such an obvious point, but it can be overlooked. So once he was convinced, our relationship suddenly, previously almost half the trilateral was meant to bring Pakistan and Afghanistan together. Now that was no longer necessary because the ultimate reason for the discord was removed. But then the question arises, okay, Pakistan will declare non-interference and no favorites. What about other countries? And we were asked this, if other people are trying to fill that power vacuum, you can't leave power vacuum, then how do we withdraw? So that is when we conveyed to our interlocutors and other stakeholders that if there's a regional approach to non-interference, then the policy will succeed than nobody else. So then with the US representative as well as others, the first meeting on that subject took place last week in Geneva on the 6th of March, where the agenda in which Russia was there, Iran was there, India was there, and United States, and so 7 countries, and Afghanistan. So that was the first attempt at talking about non-interference and what it means. And I hope, and this would be a very important step because in the past, the big powers were, of course, playing the big games, but even other stakeholders also joined in. So this is an objective that is just beginning to emerge. It's work in progress. It is not yet fully clinched, but it's a policy that everybody, and in my interactions with my Indian counterpart and Iranian counterpart, they seem to say yes. But then they also say, some people say that power vacuum can never exist for very long. So unless after the ISAF forces there is a reconciliation and the Afghans themselves fill the power vacuum, what will happen? So I think this is where there is need for very imaginative thinking. There is a need for restoration of trust, that so-and-so will say, okay, I do it, but then somebody else will break that. And some kind of mechanism, and we have about more than 24 mechanisms of various kinds. So we are now streamlining them, trying to see what was the aim of each, how many were useful, how many are not useful, how to streamline them, and make consultative mechanism not too large, but reasonably large, which can achieve this objective. So it's something that needs to be pursued.
Thank you for the detailed response. Let me turn to the floor because I know there are several people who want to ask a question or make a comment. Let me first start with my colleague Ben Barry, the IISS Senior Fellow for Land Warfare. Ben.
Thank you very much for a very clear articulation of Pakistan's strategic direction of travel. I don't think you mentioned the US and NATO plans for a residual military and security presence from 2015 onwards, because President Obama has committed to a counter-terrorism mission, and both he and NATO have committed to train, advise and assist, progress and planning of which is on block at the moment because of President Karzai's refusal to sign the broader security agreement. But how important a part of the strategic jigsaw do you think they are?
Well, obviously, the BSA bilateral security agreement was the basis on which USA was ready to keep some residual forces. And initially, I think there was expectation that with the deadline was October last year, and then it was stretched to the end of the year. And President Karzai called LOA Jirga to endorse that, and they unanimously endorsed that and added 31 clarifications or conditions on the basis of which they had approved it. But when that happened, he says, I'm not going to sign. Now, obviously, he's looking at his place in history and trying to present, and my feeling is there was a little incentive for electioneering also, that if he signs, then of course it may affect the election prospects. Now, what will happen? Obviously, they need some time to plan withdrawals, and so to that extent, the urgency of the matter. But Pakistan's policy in that has been very clear, that this is a matter between Afghanistan as a sovereign country and USA to decide what they want. So we have not interfered nor made any comment on the subject in public. But our own assessment is that without some residual forces, the capacity of the Afghan security forces to withstand the pressures that may come on them would not be adequate. And this is mainly because they lack an air force. Because air force is necessary to prevent insurgency from becoming a blitzkrieg. And therefore, unless they have that capacity. They say it by 2017 they will have an air force, but not right now. So I think some alternative will have to be found. Either USA will have to position troops without having the guarantees of obviously the purpose is that they should not be subject to Afghan law but their own law, and that is a sticking point, and also searching homes kind of things. But I think ultimately the new government after the election will have to find some solutions. So that will squeeze the time which NATO has to plan the withdrawals, but I think it will still be managed. So it is a critical factor, and the one deciding factor might be money, because they can't get all the money that they need to pay their security forces if there is no BSA. So in that sense, I think it will force them to accept something. But I agree that this is something, but we as a country have stayed out of that discussion, and we don't make any comment on the subject. In fact, the Prime Minister said this is for you to decide, and we are not coming.
Professor Anatole Lieven, the King's College London.
Thank you. Very nice to see you again, sir. It's often said that the most important external relationship for the future of Afghanistan may be that between Pakistan and India. I wonder if you can tell us whether you see any opportunities for a Pakistani-Indian dialogue on Afghanistan, and if you also see any possibility of Pakistani and Indian interests and views coming together on that subject. Thank you.
You see, part of it depends on India-Pakistan relation themselves. And as I mentioned earlier, in our Prime Minister's policy on the subject is very clear. His priority is economic revival, because without a strong economy, you can't do anything. So, but economic revival requires a peaceful neighborhood. So in the very first few weeks, we announced our policy of better relations with India and better relations with Afghanistan. And Afghanistan, I've already mentioned. With India, the relationship were improving, but some incidents derailed them, and now the election is coming up. So partly it depends on our relationship, and I'm hopeful that after the elections, the composite dialogue will pick up, and our commitment to improve relations will remain on track. India's role in Afghanistan was always looked at by many powers in terms of an effort to balance our support for Taliban with India's support to the other side. This is the syndrome of the 90s. It is not today valid today. So once this particular equation has changed in the sense that we are no longer supporting them, so you don't need India in that context. So that's why we were initially resistant to any Indian involvement sitting together. But once this was done, for the first time, we got participating in the meeting in Geneva in which India was also present. And because the agenda was a regional approach to non-interference. And then, of course, reconstruction, and there we are ready to compete, fully in reconstruction, development, and all the assistance. So I think the extent to which if India accepts this non-interference philosophy and genuinely follows it, then, of course, forums will develop in which this process will be carried further. But still some of the mindsets are still looking at it in the old equation, which is now out of date. So I hope it will, in that way, we'll be able to resolve the issue.
Shahzadi Beg.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and succinct presentation. I've got two short questions. The first is that regional consensus becomes very difficult when you have cross-border terrorism on both sides. What is the government seriously hoping to achieve with talks with the TTP? We know that every peace agreement since 2004 has failed. We know that this is an organization that neither recognizes the constitution, nor democracy, nor the rule of law, and has now held arms against the state for more than a decade. My second question is that following the recent visit to Pakistan by Prince Salman of Saudi Arabia, the English dailies, that's all the English dailies in Pakistan, the Gulf News, the Times in London, have reported that there is a deal done through Saudi Arabia to channel arms into Syria for the Syrian rebels by Pakistan to be channeled through, I believe, Jordan. Is this true? Or have the world's press got this wrong? And if this is true, how much of a risk do you think Pakistan is putting itself in by getting involved in Syria and antagonizing Iran?
On the first question, as you know, it's a very complex issue because we have managed to clear 6 out of 7 agencies, starting with SWAT in 2009, then South Waziristan, then Bajor and Orakzai and others. The only one left is North Waziristan. And unfortunately, the process did not continue in 2010. Otherwise, now the task would be much easier. But now I think we can't delay this anymore in the sense of establishing our writ there. Because after 2014, when the ISAF forces leave, the danger of Afghan Taliban and they joining hands will become stronger. So we have to sort out that problem soon. But obviously, without talking to those people who are ready to talk, you can't isolate those who are the main obstacle to peace. And this dialogue process, even if it doesn't produce concrete results very quickly, creates a consensus. Without a political consensus, if you carry out any operation, the blowback can be very strong. So this talk, fight is a normal strategy in which you achieve your objective much more easily. So I hope in the coming weeks you will see the results and it will be helpful. On the second question, the answer is a definite no. I think the AFP story was very misleading. There was no basis for it. We have not discussed any arms sale. We have a long-standing agreement with Saudi Arabia on training and other issues and small arms. We don't produce the kind of things that story talked about, and we have contradicted it also. And our statement on Syria was not at all what Saudi Arabia's own policy is. We stick strictly to Geneva one language, transitional authority, as well as forces withdrawing, humanitarian assistance, and so on and so forth. So I think in fact, the Syrian government appreciated our statement on that subject after the statement came out. So there are, of course, vested interests who want to spread all kinds of rumor, and we have protested to AFP for putting out a story without verification. And I think the other people picked it up, as if it was true. And I think in this case, we are very anxious that the manner in which Syria has been handled in the last 2 years has not solved the problem and led to very serious humanitarian crisis. So our interest in having a peaceful solution remains undiminished.
Thank you. The gentleman there, if you could identify yourself, please. I'm sorry if...
Thank you. Welcome to London, sir. I'm one of your admirers. And I will quote from a Chilean philosopher says, you can kill the flowers, but you can't stop the spring. My question to you...
your name, sorry, if you could...
My name is Dr. Shahid Qureshi. I wrote a book on war on terror and siege of Pakistan. And I'm Bureau Chief of Frontier Post in London. My question is related to the high rate of military casualties in Pakistan. Because, and the analysis, I've got 5 years figure of national crime data, which suggests that you have about 64,000 murders in Pakistan in 5 years. And the police and the civilian intelligence agencies have completely failed, as your interior minister suggested, to protect the national interest, and the army is left to take the brunt. So do you see any change in the current government regarding depoliticizing police training, terrorism, what Barry has mentioned? So any kind of policy regarding that?
Yes, I think we have just announced an national internal security policy, which is aimed exactly at that particular problem. As you know, national security is a broad subject. It includes foreign policy, it includes defense policy, it includes internal security. But in our case, since we haven't had a national security system, we've just set up one as the Cabinet Committee on National Security. The urgency was on the internal security. We can write language on foreign policy and defense policy, but the operational content of those policies, whether it's Afghan policy, whether it's policy vis-a-vis India, policy vis-a-vis USA and some other countries, has to be articulated and operationalized. Once those happen, your national security policy is not just language, but operationally meaningful. So since that will take some time, we went ahead and finalized the internal security policy, whose document was announced in the National Assembly about 2 weeks ago. And that policy addresses this issue because we have had also lack of coordination among intelligence agencies. The police is not normally trained for counterinsurgency, so some rangers come in. In some places, military has done it. So our new counterintelligence NACTA, the counterinsurgency force, will draw all those people who have some experience of counterinsurgency and give them training and equipment for the new role. But then there will be provincial counterintelligence agencies which will do the same, plus intelligence coordination, plus rapid response force. So that internal security document is available on the web page, and you can access that, and you will see that this is not an easy task because we have lost, I think our estimate is 50,000 total civilian casualties from the terror attacks, but they include about 10, 12,000 security personnel. So it's a very serious issue for us, and this is, as I mentioned in my statement, that our security concerns were not given enough importance in the past. And I mentioned this in our strategic dialogue in USA. As I said, when the Russians left, everybody else also left Afghanistan and let us all. 9/11, when Afghanistan was attacked, our security concerns were not taken into account. And all those people that we had jointly trained, armed, and funded for fighting the Russians were pushed into our side of the tribal areas, and they have become a threat to us. So this sensitivity to our security concerns has to be heightened so that we are, of course, trying to look after our own house and not be over-adventurous in what we do elsewhere, and that's why non-interference is a major reversal of our past experience. But I hope that we can clear the baggage that we have inherited along with it as we go along.
Murtaza Ali Shah, Geo Television.
Hi, Murtaza Ali Shah from GeoTV and Young Group of Newspapers. I've got two short questions. The first one, that Pakistan has often complained that Afghan soil has been used to incite terrorism within Pakistan. Can you tell us which countries do you suspect are involved behind some of the groups fighting against Pakistani forces? And then about the situation within Pakistan, do you know which Taliban groups is the Pakistan Muslim League government right now talking to? Because one group announced ceasefire, but still there were terror attacks. Dozens of people have died, and there is another, a new dialogue thing in process. So, can you tell us which groups Pakistani government is sure that it is talking to, and what happens if this level of talks fail? What next?
Well, as you've heard already, there are 40, 50 groups, so one can't say which is talking, and they are very amorphous kind of groups. But right now, those who want to talk, the talks are going on, but also subject to what is called a ceasefire. So those groups who violate the ceasefire will be targeted. And as you saw last time when there were surgical strikes against certain targets, then the ceasefire was announced. So this policy will continue against those groups which violate the ceasefire or don't participate in the dialogue. But ultimately, the purpose is to re-establish the writ of state in North Waziristan and try to prevent it from being used against Pakistan. This is a very important objective, and I hope it can be achieved partly through dialogue and partly through action. And there is no substitute for, as I mentioned earlier, out of 7 agencies, in 6 agencies, we have already restored the writ of state. This is the last one in which we have to complete the job. Now, the other question that you ask in this context is partly related, that if talks fail, you establish the writ either through dialogue, which means people accept the writ of state and give up the arms. If they don't, then you deal with them through military force. And I think the Afghan style that you mentioned, this was going on in the past as a tit for tat, I would suppose, because they thought Pakistan is doing the same. Now I think there is greater understanding that neither side should allow their territory to be used. And as we proceed in this whole process, I think both sides will be able to benefit. But there are non-state actors who try to draw sustenance from each other and interact. So for that, we are planning much tighter border management between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Right now, it's an open border, only 2 exit points, and we are establishing many more with different kind of technology, biometrics, as well as CCTV cameras. So that will also ensure that no people go from there and no people come from there. So these are some of the measures through which we hope to overcome this situation.
Was there a question on this row, the 5th? Okay, sorry, yes. Yes, please. Yes, sorry, yes.
Thank you.
Could you
Mr.
identify
Aziz
yourself,
Saab,
please?
Yeah, my name is Sami Yusufzai. I work for Newsweek and Daily Beast. The common perception in Afghanistan is that one of the reasons that Pakistan doesn't want a stable Afghanistan, that Afghanistan and Pakistan has this disputed Durand line. If there is a stable Afghanistan, they will raise the issue of a Durand line. And that is the reason, and some elements in Pakistan still supporting Taliban to destabilize Afghanistan. And my second question is, if the deal with the TTP taking place, what is the guarantee that these militants will not cross to Afghanistan and destabilize further Afghanistan? Are you going to bound the Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, not to fight in Afghanistan, or how it's possible practically to stop on that border? Thank you.
See, the first question is certainly not the reason. As I explained in great detail, that the Afghan stability is more important for Pakistan. If Afghanistan is not stable, we are not stable. So in that sense, the Durand line is not a live issue right now. It's a physical boundary irrespective of what, and I don't think this will come up in the foreseeable future. The more important thing is how to have peace and stability in Afghanistan, because that's necessary for us. So the very perception that Pakistan is not interested in a stable Afghanistan is just ignores the basic reality that without stability in Afghanistan, we can't be stable. So I think this perception is now much more widely understood in Afghanistan. Last year, I don't know, but right now, it is dominantly accepted. The second part, as I mentioned earlier, we have to deal with the TTP in our own border. And we have already told US and other people that if we do take action, you have to make sure that nobody moves there. It is not our responsibility. And so those who go there are the responsibility of other powers, and those who stay with us, we have to deal with them. So I think this is important. We don't want to, the whole policy of non-interference means that we are not going to participate in anybody else's fighting or wars, and we don't want anybody else to participate in our side. So this is a very good policy in the future. And we are suffering from interferences in the past, and we don't want to repeat that in the future.
Thank you. I'm going to sort of take two questions and then we'll come back. The time is running short. Yes, please. And then Antoine. Yes, please. Please identify yourself.
Gautam Sen, retired international relations academic. It's a question that Anatole Levin raised, which actually has been touched on in a discussion in India, which was in more detail that Pakistan and India should float a joint organization for reconstruction in Afghanistan to create mutual confidence. And of course, much of the work will be done on a more cost-effective basis if it originates in the region. The Indian reaction, and I will tell you from a very senior official, was that Pakistan will never agree. So that's one question I want to put to you so I can take this message back. The second thing is that the power vacuum that you talked about is actually of great importance in Afghanistan. And the power vacuum issue was resolved somewhat simply because the Taliban prevailed. Now the Taliban is not quite able to prevail. Is this not a condition in which a civil war will be resumed in Afghanistan? Terrible outcome for Afghans and for everybody in the region after what they have been through in the last 30 years. But do you think if such a civil war is resumed, third parties will be able to stand aside and simply wait for an outcome, or will they become involved? Thank you.
So let me just take another one. And then yes, Antoine was...
Thank you, sir. Antoine Levesque from IISS. My question relates to sectarian violence in Pakistan. Do you think the situation in Afghanistan has any bearing on the levels of violence of a sectarian nature? Thank you.
See, on the first question, when you talk of a reconstruction company, reconstruction is required in a very large number of sectors. It's in transport, it's in education, it's in infrastructure, it's in industry, so on and so forth. So I don't think even professionally speaking, a single construction company can handle everything. So I think both countries should, India is already doing a number of projects. They are building hospitals, we are building hospitals, they are building agriculture, rehabilitation, agriculture, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a need for all kind of help. So we should continue to do in an individual project. If we can cooperate, we should cooperate. But there is no need for an agency which will be unwieldy and difficult to manage. I think case-to-case basis, if there's something happening in a particular project like a hospital, we can build 2 departments. India can build 2 departments. That is fine. There is no question about it. Now, on the other issue, the outbreak of fighting, I think right now the situation is very different from the 90s, in which see Taliban kind of overran the country because the other side was not organized. Now there are 350,000 Afghan security forces which have some capacity, and in the past they have done equally well. Northern Alliance is much better organized than they were at that time. And Taliban already have some areas where they have some local autonomy and influence. That they will continue to do. And they may try to stretch the border of that a little bit, but depending on the Air Force availability, one shouldn't think a major civil war would break out, because some people have this feeling that they can take over Afghanistan again, but I think most of them are realistic and they know it won't happen. So in that context, there will be no motivation of anybody to join, and nobody should join. Even if there is fighting, let the Afghan defend themselves. The Western powers are giving them help. They can give them more in the form of weapons or whatever they want to give them. But I don't think this should suck in, and that's what I mentioned earlier, that if we have a policy of non-interference, other people should follow it. Otherwise, it will become more complicated. And every time you see foreign involvement, whether it's in Libya, whether it's Syria, it always leads to disastrous consequences. So I don't think this is something, a lesson that everybody should learn vis-a-vis Afghanistan. As I mentioned, it's a graveyard of empires. So if empires could not survive, how can small powers survive by interfering in Afghanistan? Then, of course, on the other question, the sectarian violence. This is, unfortunately, for the last few years, a dominant thing. There has been no, the TTP and the Afghan Taliban issues is not sectarian in nature, but at the local level, they do draw sustenance from each other because they are also against the government and something, so there may be some collaboration. But I think we have to deal with the sectarian issues in a much more fundamental way. It is not just confined to Pakistan. It's in other parts of the Middle East also. And this is, the unity of the Islamic world is very important. And I think as an overall thing, we should make sure that Muslims don't kill Muslims in the name of sectarian conflict. Otherwise, they'll weaken each other. And therefore, sectarian harmony is a guarantee for what I call unity of the Muslim Ummah. And that is an objective that we should pursue in OIC and elsewhere so that we can avoid this major rift that has been spreading like cancer in the Muslim world.
I'm going to have to disappoint some of you, as there's only time for one last question, and Myra McDonald had got my eye on that. So Myra.
Yeah, I had a sort of Pakistan-India related question mostly, but I mean, as you know, it's been an artificial period between 2001 and 2014 with the Americans there. There is, as I'm sure you're aware, concern in India that Pakistan will revert to some of the pre-2001 policies, and in particular, pushing some of its more problematic jihadis into Kashmir as a means of dealing with the internal problem in Pakistan. I wonder if you could comment on the sort of the Kashmir side of things, and I had a specific on that, was why, given how sensitive it is, was Maulana Masood Azhar allowed to speak in public recently, because that really raised the Indian suspicions about a revival of the old jihad in Kashmir and jihad in Afghanistan.
I think those who still live in this mindset are not aware of the latest situation and the changes that have taken place. I mean, when policies do not succeed for a long period of time, you have to change them. And as I mentioned in my own presentation very clearly, that we are now giving priority to our own security rather than indulge in adventures that in the long run are counterproductive. So I hope the sooner the India understand this and change there, because our Musharraf was very flexible on Kashmir, and it was not reciprocated at all. We have been urging, to deal with the issues much more. And somehow the Indian response has not been positive. So I think the sooner we, I can almost say that the peace constituency today is stronger in Pakistan than in India. And I think we can't clinch all the opportunities that exist in the region, both for trade and for energy connectivity. But we can't do it if we are not peace. Our SARC has not made progress because of the India-Pakistan problem. The whole world, the regional cooperation, whether it is ASEAN, whether it is ECOWAS, whether it is, of course, EEC is there and many other organizations. And we can't face the world alone unless we cooperate. So I think these are the opportunities for cooperation and regional growth are enormous. And the sooner India understand that and get out of the previous mindset of apprehensions and resume the peace process, we are not going to clinch these opportunities. So I think it is important that, and we hope the new government after the elections will resume the dialogue, the composite dialogue, and resolve as many issues as we can, not just CVMs. And so I hope that that will happen.
Well, it's been truly a fascinating session, both the talk as well as the question-answer part of it. I am particularly impressed that Mr. Aziz has responded in such a magisterial way to the questions, without also, a requirement to look at any briefing paper or a briefing note. And I think this is testimony to his tremendous experience and expertise as the foreign minister of Pakistan earlier, and also his involvement on some of the key issues that we've been discussing. So with these words, I would like to sort of end this session. But just before I do that, I'd like to say that Mr. Aziz has another engagement immediately after this session. So I'd be grateful if you could all stay in your seats when we take Mr. Aziz out of this room. But before I formally end, I'd like you all to join me in showing our appreciation to Mr. Sartaj Aziz for his talk and the discussion session. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.